Simon's papa. Guy de Maupassant. Noon had just struck. The school door opened and the youngsters darted out, jostling each other in their haste to get out quickly. But instead of promptly dispersing and going home to dinner as usual, they stopped a few paces off, broke up into knots, and began whispering. The fact was that morning, Simon, the son of La Blanchotte, had, for the first time, attended school. They had all of them in their families heard talk of La Blanchotte, and, although in public she was welcome enough, the mothers among themselves treated her with a somewhat disdainful compassion which the children had imitated without in the least knowing why. As for Simon himself, they did not know him, for he never went out and did not run about with them in the streets of the village, or along the banks of the river, and they did not care for him, so it was with a certain delight, mingled with considerable astonishment, that they met and repeated to each other what had been said by a lad of 14 or 15, who appeared to know all about it, so sagaciously did he wink. You know, Simon, well, he has no papa. Just then La Blanchotte's son appeared in the doorway of the school. He was 7 or 8 years old, rather pale, very neat, with a timid and almost awkward manner. He was starting home to his mother's house when the groups of his schoolmates, whispering and watching him with the mischievous and heartless eyes of children bent upon playing a nasty trick, gradually closed in around him and ended by surrounding him altogether. There he stood in their midst, surprised and embarrassed, not understanding what they were going to do with him. But the lad who had brought the news, puffed up with the success he had met with already, demanded, "What's your name, you?" He answered, "Simon." "Simon what?" retorted the other. The child, altogether bewildered, repeated, "Simon." The lad shouted at him, "One is named Simon something. That is not a name. Simon indeed." The child, on the brink of tears, replied for the third time, "My name is Simon." The urchins began to laugh. The triumphant tormentor cried, "You can see plainly that he has no papa." A deep silence ensued. The children were dumbfounded by this extraordinary, impossible, monstrous thing, a boy who had not a papa. They looked upon him as a phenomenon, an unnatural being, and they felt that hitherto inexplicable contempt of their mothers for La Blanchotte growing upon them. As for Simon, he had leaned against a tree to avoid falling, and he remained as if prostrated by an irreparable disaster. He sought to explain, but could think of nothing to say to refute this horrible charge that he had no papa. At last he shouted at them quite recklessly, "Yes, I have one." "Where is he?" demanded the boy. Simon was silent. He did not know. The children roared, tremendously excited, and those country boys, little more than animals, experienced that cruel craving which prompts the fowls of a farmyard to destroy one of their number as soon as it is wounded. Simon suddenly espied a little neighbor, the son of a widow, whom he had seen, as he himself was to be seen, always alone with his mother. "And no more have you," he said. "No more have you a papa." "Yes," replied the other, "I have one." "Where is he?" rejoined Simon. "He is dead," declared the brat with superb dignity. "He is in the cemetery, is my papa." A murmur of approval rose among the little wretches, as if this fact of possessing a papa dead in a cemetery had caused their comrade to grow big enough to crush the other one who had no papa at all. And these boys, whose fathers were for the most part bad men, drunkards, thieves, and who beat their wives, jostled each other to press closer and closer, as though they, the legitimate ones, would smother by their pressure one who was illegitimate. The boy who chanced to be next to Simon suddenly put his tongue out at him with a mocking air and shouted at him, "No papa! No papa!" Simon seized him by the hair with both hands and set to work to disable his legs with kicks, while he bit his cheek ferociously. A tremendous struggle ensued between the two combatants, and Simon found himself beaten, torn, bruised, rolled on the ground in the midst of the ring of applauding schoolboys. As he arose, mechanically brushing with his hand his little blouse all covered with dust, someone shouted at him, "Go and tell your papa!" Then he felt a great sinking at his heart. They were stronger than he was. They had beaten him, and he had no answer to give them, for he knew well that it was true that he had no papa. Full of pride, he attempted for some moments to struggle against the tears which were choking him. He had a feeling of suffocation, and then without any sound he commenced to weep with great shaking sobs. A ferocious joy broke out among his enemies, and, with one accord, just like savages in their fearful festivals, they took each other by the hand and danced round him in a circle, repeating as a refrain, "No papa! No papa!" But suddenly Simon ceased sobbing. He became ferocious. There were stones under his feet. He picked them up and with all his strength hurled them at his tormentors. 2 or 3 were struck and rushed off yelling, and so formidable did he appear that the rest became panic-stricken. Cowards, as the mob always is in the presence of an exasperated man, they broke up and fled. Left alone, the little fellow without a father set off running toward the fields, for a recollection had been awakened in him which determined his soul to a great resolve. He made up his mind to drown himself in the river. He remembered, in fact, that 8 days before, a poor devil who begged for his livelihood had thrown himself into the water because he had no more money. Simon had been there when they fished him out again, and the wretched man, who usually seemed to him so miserable and ugly, had then struck him as being so peaceful, with his pale cheeks, his long drenched beard, and his open eyes full of calm. The bystanders had said, "He is dead," and someone said, "He is quite happy now." And Simon wished to drown himself also, because he had no father, just like the wretched being who had no money. He reached the water and watched it flowing. Some fish were sporting briskly in the clear stream, and occasionally made a little bound and caught the flies flying on the surface. He stopped crying in order to watch them, for their maneuvers interested him greatly. But at intervals, as in tempest intervals of calm, alternate suddenly with tremendous gusts of wind, which snap off the trees and then lose themselves in the horizon, this thought would return to him with intense pain. I am going to drown myself because I have no papa. It was very warm, fine weather. The pleasant sunshine warmed the grass. The water shone like a mirror, and Simon enjoyed some minutes of happiness, of that languor which follows weeping, and felt inclined to fall asleep there upon the grass in the warm sunshine. A little green frog leaped from under his feet. He endeavored to catch it. It escaped him. He followed it and lost it 3 times in succession. At last he caught it by one of its hind legs and began to laugh as he saw the efforts the creature made to escape. It gathered itself up on its hind legs, and then with a violent spring suddenly stretched them out as stiff as 2 bars, while it beat the air with its front legs as though they were hands, its round eyes staring in their circle of yellow. It reminded him of a toy made of straight slips of wood nailed zigzag one on the other, by which a similar movement regulated the movements of the toy soldiers fastened thereon. Then he thought of his home, and then of his mother, and overcome by sorrow he began again to weep. A shiver passed over him. He knelt down and said his prayers as before going to bed, but he was unable to finish them, for tumultuous violent sobs shook his whole frame. He no longer thought, he no longer saw anything around him, and was wholly absorbed in crying. Suddenly a heavy hand was placed upon his shoulder, and a rough voice asked him, "What is it that causes you so much grief, my little man?" Simon turned round. A tall workman with a beard and curly black hair was standing and staring at him good-naturedly. He answered with his eyes and throat full of tears, "They beat me because I have no papa, no papa." "What?" said the man, smiling. "Why, everybody has one." The child answered painfully amid his spasms of grief, "But I have none." Then the workman became serious. He had recognized La Blanchotte's son, and, although himself a new arrival in the neighborhood, he had a vague idea of her history. "Well," said he, "console yourself, my boy, and come with me home to your mother. She'll give you a papa." And so they started on the way, the big fellow holding the little fellow by the hand, and the man smiled, for he was not sorry to see this Blanchotte, who was, it was said, one of the prettiest girls of the countryside, and, perhaps, he was saying to himself, at the bottom of his heart, that a lass who had erred might very well err again. They arrived in front of a very neat little white house. "There it is!" exclaimed the child, and he cried, "Mamma!" A woman appeared, and the workman instantly left off smiling, for he saw at once that there was no fooling to be done with the tall, pale girl who stood austerely at her door, as though to defend from one man the threshold of that house where she had already been betrayed by another. Intimidated, his cap in his hand, he stammered out, "See, madame, I have brought you back your little boy who lost himself near the river." But Simon flung his arms about his mother's neck and told her, as he again began to cry, "No, mamma, I wish to drown myself because others had beaten me because I have no papa." A burning redness covered the young woman's cheeks, and, hurt to the quick, she embraced her child passionately while the tears coursed down her face. The man, much moved, stood there, not knowing how to get away. But Simon suddenly ran to him and said, "Will you be my papa?" A deep silence ensued. La Blanchotte, dumb and tortured with shame, leaned herself against the wall, both her hands upon her heart. The child, seeing that no answer was made him, replied, "If you will not, I shall go back and drown myself." The workman took the matter as a jest, and answered, laughing, "Why, yes, certainly I will." "What is your name?" went on the child, "so that I may tell the others when they wish to know your name." "Phillip," answered the man. Simon was silent a moment, so that he might get the name well into his head, Then he stretched out his arms, quite consoled, as he said, "Well then, Philip, you are my papa." The workman, lifting him from the ground, kissed him hastily on both cheeks, and then walked away very quickly with great strides. When the child returned to school the next day, he was received with a spiteful laugh, and at the end of school, when the lads were on the point of recommencing, Simon threw these words at their heads as he would have done a stone: "He is named Philip, my papa." Yells of delight burst out from all sides. "Philip who? Philip what? What on earth is Philip? Where did you pick up your Philip?" Simon answered nothing, and, immovable in his faith, he defied them with his eye, ready to be martyred rather than fly before them. The schoolmaster came to his rescue, and he returned home to his mother. During 3 months the tall workman Philip frequently passed by La Blanchotte's house, and sometimes he made bold to speak to her when he saw her sewing near the window. She answered him civilly, always sedately, never joking with him nor permitting him to enter her house. Notwithstanding, being, like all men, a bit of a coxcomb, he imagined that she was often rosier than usual when she chatted with him. But a lost reputation is so difficult to regain and always remains so fragile that, in spite of the shy reserve of La Blanchotte, they already gossiped in the neighborhood. As for Simon, he loved his new papa very much, and walked with him nearly every evening when the day's work was done. He went regularly to school, and mixed with great dignity with his schoolfellows without ever answering them back. One day, however, the lad who had first attacked him said to him, "You have lied. You have not a papa named Philip." "Why do you say that?" demanded Simon, much disturbed. The youth rubbed his hands. He replied, "Because if you had one, he would be your mamma's husband." Simon was confused by the truth of this reasoning. Nevertheless, he retorted, "He is my papa all the same." "That can very well be," exclaimed the urchin with a sneer, "but that is not being your papa altogether." La Blanchotte's little one bowed his head and went off dreaming in the direction of the forge belonging to old Loison, where Philip worked. The forge was as though buried beneath trees. It was very dark there. The red glare of a formidable furnace alone lit up with great flashes 5 blacksmiths, who hammered upon their anvils with a terrible din. They were standing enveloped in flame, like demons, their eyes fixed on the red-hot iron they were pounding, and their dull ideas rose and fell with their hammers. Simon entered without being noticed, and went quietly to pluck his friend by the sleeve. The latter turned round. All at once the work came to a standstill, and all the men looked on, very attentive. Then, in the midst of this unaccustomed silence, rose the slender pipe of Simon. "Say, Philip, the Michaud boy told me just now that you were not altogether my papa." "Why not?" asked the blacksmith. The child replied with all innocence, "Because you are not my mamma's husband." No one laughed. Philip remained standing, leaning his forehead upon the back of his great hands, which supported the handle of his hammer standing upright upon the anvil. He mused. His 4 companions watched him, and Simon, a tiny mite among these giants, anxiously waited. Suddenly, one of the smiths, answering to the sentiment of all, said to Philip, "La Blanchotte is a good, honest girl, and upright and steady in spite of her misfortune, and would make a worthy wife for an honest man." "That is true," remarked the 3 others. The smith continued, "Is it the girl's fault if she went wrong? She had been promised marriage, and I know more than one who is much respected today, and who sinned every bit as much." "That is true," responded the 3 men in chorus. He resumed, "How hard she has toiled, poor thing, to bring up her child all alone, and now she has wept all these years she has never gone out except to church, God only knows." "This is also true," said the others. Then nothing was heard but the bellows which fanned the fire of the furnace. Philip hastily bent himself down to Simon. "Go and tell your mother that I am coming to speak to her this evening." Then he pushed the child out by the shoulders. He returned to his work, and with a single blow the 5 hammers again fell upon their anvils. Thus they wrought the iron until nightfall, strong, powerful, happy, like contented hammers. But just as the great bell of a cathedral resounds upon feast days above the jingling of the other bells, so Philip's hammer, sounding above the rest, clanged second after second with a deafening uproar, and he stood amid the flying sparks, plying his trade vigorously. The sky was full of stars as he knocked at La Blanchotte's door. He had on his Sunday blouse, a clean shirt, and his beard was trimmed. The young woman showed herself upon the threshold, and said in a grieved tone, "It is ill to come thus when night has fallen, Philip." He wished to answer, but stammered and stood confused before her. She resumed, "You understand, do you not, that it will not do for me to be talked about again?" "What does that matter to me if you will be my wife?" No voice replied to him, but he believed that he heard in the shadow of the room the sound of a falling body. He entered quickly, and Simon, who had gone to bed, distinguished the sound of a kiss and some words that his mother murmured softly. Then, all at once, he found himself lifted up by the hands of his friend, who, holding him at the length of his Herculean arms, exclaimed, "You will tell them, your schoolmates, that your papa is Phillip Remy the blacksmith, and that he will pull the ears off of all who do you any harm." On the morrow, when the school was full and lessons were about to begin, little Simon stood up, quite pale with trembling lips. "My papa," he said in a clear voice, "is Phillip Remy the blacksmith, and he has promised to pull the ears of all who does me any harm." This time no one laughed, for he was very well known was Phillip Remy the blacksmith, and was a papa of whom anyone in the world would have been proud. End of section 155. Recording by Tatiana Chichilla, Columbus, Ohio.